The stagecoach groaned into Dry Creek on a wave of its own red dust, a tired beast shedding a single passenger into the unrelenting afternoon sun. The town was little more than a gash in the plains. A straight line of weathered wood buildings huddled on either side of a wide, rutted street. A saloon, a post office, a blacksmith's shop whose hammer was for the moment silent, and the imposing false front of the county courthouse. The air itself felt worn thin, smelling of hot dust, cattle grease, and the faint, bitter scent of creosote. A dry wind, born somewhere far to the west, whispered through the gaps in the buildings, carrying with it the grit that settled on every surface, in every fold of clothing, on the back of every tongue. Madeline stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her worn boots sinking slightly. In one hand, she held a small, tightly packed carpet bag that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions. She stood for a moment, letting the stagecoach rattle away, a lone figure in a plain brown dress against the vast, indifferent landscape. On the covered porch of the saloon, a group of men stopped their conversation to watch her. Their eyes took in the simple dress, the determined set of her jaw, and the smallness of her luggage. A low chuckle drifted on the wind. One man leaned over to another, his voice a conspiratorial rumble, just loud enough to carry. "Look at that. The wind might blow her away before nightfall. That little thing ain't got nothing to her name but the dust she's standing in. Mocked for owning nothing." She squared her shoulders and walked toward the courthouse, her spine as straight as the single barren street. The air inside the county office was thick with the smells of stale tobacco, ink, and unwashed bodies. It was packed with ranchers in sweat-stained hats, merchants with soft hands and watchful eyes, and a few drifters hoping for a spectacle. They were all there for the auction of seized properties, a regular and somber entertainment in a land where fortunes turned as quickly as the weather. Madeleine found a spot near the back, her presence a quiet anomaly in the sea of rough-shod masculinity. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a waistcoat straining at the buttons, worked his way through a list of minor lots, a set of blacksmith tools, a wagon with a broken axle, a handful of cattle whose brands were in dispute. Then he cleared his throat and announced the final item. "All right, folks, next up is the Lone Lantern Ranch, 60 acres, more or less, situated along Hawk Draw." A murmur went through the room, a mix of pity and amusement. "Comes with what's left of a 2-room house, a barn, and a well." He paused for dramatic effect, though everyone knew what was coming. "House has had a bit of a fire. The barn is leaning friendly-like with the wind. And the well, it's seen better days." He was being generous. The Lone Lantern was a ghost, a testament to failure. The family that had tried to work it had been broken by drought, then fire, and had finally drifted away, leaving behind their debt and their bad luck. "What am I bid for this fine piece of opportunity?" the auctioneer bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. Silence. The men shuffled their feet. One coughed to cover a laugh. The property was worthless. The land was parched. The buildings were ruins, and the water situation was a known joke. Hawk Draw was barely a trickle for most of the year. "Come on now, surely someone wants to start, let us say, $50. More silence. Thicker this time. The price was an insult, a clear signal that the county just wanted the property off its books. $20 then. $20 for 60 acres of Texas land. It is a steal." Madeline's voice, clear and steady, cut through the heavy air. $25. Every head in the room turned. The collective surprise was a physical thing, a sudden intake of breath that sucked the dust motes from the sunbeams slanting through the tall windows. They stared at the small woman in the plain dress, her face pale but composed. The auctioneer blinked, his professional rhythm broken. "I have $25 from the lady in the back. Do I hear 30? A wave of low, rumbling laughter filled the room. It was not cruel, not exactly, but it was dismissive. The sound of men who understood the harsh calculus of this land and saw before them someone who clearly did not. They saw a woman, alone, buying a piece of cursed ground with what was likely her last few dollars. From a corner of the room, a man watched without joining the laughter. He was tall and lean, dressed in the dark, practical clothes of a man who worked for a living but did not soil his hands. His face was all sharp angles, and a thin, knowing smile touched his lips as he observed the scene. His name was Creed Barton, and he missed nothing. "Do I hear 30?" the auctioneer repeated, his voice regaining its practiced cadence. The room remained silent, save for a few lingering chuckles. "Going once, going twice. Sold to the young lady for $25. The crack of his gavel was like a gunshot, and the laughter erupted anew, louder this time, as men clapped each other on the back and shook their heads in disbelief. Madeline ignored them. She made her way to the front of the room, counted out the silver coins from a worn leather purse, and waited for the clerk to draw up the deed. As she stood there, the center of a joke she refused to acknowledge, she felt a pair of eyes on her, not the mocking eyes of the crowd, but a different sort of gaze, steady and assessing. She looked up and saw the town sheriff, Eli Harper, leaning against the far wall. He was not laughing. He pushed himself off the wall and walked over as the clerk handed her the paperwork. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, calm counterpoint to the noise in the room. He tipped his hat slightly. "Sheriff Eli Harper, I just need to witness your signature." She took the pen and signed her name, Madeline Farwell, in a neat, careful hand. The sheriff's eyes followed the movement of the pen, then lifted to her face. He saw the faint tremor in her hand, but also the unwavering resolve in her gray eyes. He saw the courage that the other men had mistaken for foolishness. "That is a tough piece of land you have bought, Miss Farwell," he said, his tone even. "I am aware of that, Sheriff," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded slowly, folding his arms. He motioned to a particular clause in the stack of documents she now held. "You will want to pay attention to this. It is the old mortgage agreement." He tapped a faded paragraph. "According to this, the water rights to the main flow of Hawk Draw belong to the Lone Lantern property. That was the arrangement going back 20 years. Madeline felt a small flicker of hope. Water was life. It was everything. "However," the sheriff continued, his gaze shifting for a moment toward the corner where Creed Barton had been standing, though the man was now gone, "you should know that a new survey map was filed with the county last month. It was submitted by men working for Mr. Barton. Their survey redraws the lines. It suggests the main water channel bypasses your property entirely, shifting the rights downstream." The flicker of hope died. "Is that legal?" she asked. "That is for a judge to decide. Should it come to that, the old records are ambiguous. A good lawyer could argue it either way." He looked at her small carpet bag, at the simple dress, and did not need to ask if she could afford a good lawyer. "I just thought you should know what you are walking into." She met his gaze directly. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." He gave another slow nod, a gesture of respect, and stepped back. Madeline gathered her papers, the deed to a ruined ranch and the hint of a battle she was not equipped to fight, and walked out of the courthouse, leaving the laughter and the pity behind her. With the last of her money, she bought a sway-backed mare and a few supplies. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, she led the horse out of Dry Creek. The journey to her new home was silent and lonely. The vast, open country stretched out around her, beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. The wind picked up as evening approached, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the ghosts of all the failed dreams the land had swallowed. She finally saw it as the last light was fading, a dark shape against the darkening plains. The Lone Lantern. The sheriff's description had been an understatement. The house was a blackened skeleton, its roof gone, its walls gaping open to the sky. The barn listed so heavily it looked as if the next strong gust of wind would push it over. The well was a collapsed maw of stone and splintered wood. It was a place of absolute desolation. For a long moment, She stood there, the horse's reins loose in her hand, and allowed the full weight of her decision to settle upon her. The whispers on the saloon porch, the roaring laughter at the auction, the sheriff's gentle warning. Were they right? Had she traded everything she had for a pile of ash and a future of dust? The question echoed in the hollow space inside her. Am I a fool? The wind offered no answer, only its cold, empty sigh. Tying the horse to a scorched fence post, she walked toward the remains of the house, her boots crunching on charred wood and broken glass. The inside was a mess of debris and soot. This was where a family had lived, had eaten, had slept. Now there was nothing but ruin. She kicked at a pile of ash near the stone fireplace, her frustration and despair rising like a bitter tide. Her boot struck something hard. Curious, she knelt down, ignoring the grime that stained her dress, and dug with her bare hands. She pulled a metal object from the ashes. It was a tin lantern, dented and blackened with soot, its glass panels miraculously intact. She brushed it off, her fingers tracing the simple, sturdy lines of its construction. It was a small, ordinary thing, but here, in this place of utter loss, it felt like something more. Working with numb fingers in the growing dark, she used the supplies she had bought to fill its font with oil and trim its wick, with a spark from her flint and steel. A small, golden flame flickered to life inside the glass. She raised the lantern, holding it aloft. The yellow light pushed back the immense, pressing darkness, creating a small circle of warmth and clarity in the vast, windswept night. It cast her long shadow against the ruins of her new home, standing there, bathed in the soft glow, a tiny beacon of light against a great sea of gray-blue wind. Madeline Farwell knew the answer to her question. Perhaps she was a fool, but she was a fool with a light. And for now, that would have to be enough. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a fierce, white light that laid bare the full scope of Madeline's folly. The ruin was starker in the morning, a collection of angles and shadows that offered no comfort. Yet, she did not waste time on despair. Despair was a luxury, like a soft bed or a hot meal. Instead, she began to work. Her first priority was shelter. The burned house was a lost cause for now, but the barn, though wounded, still stood. She spent 3 days just clearing it, hauling out rotten hay, splintered timbers, and the accumulated refuse of a failed dream. Her hands, soft from a life that was now utterly gone, were soon raw, blistered, and bleeding. Each night, she would fall into an exhausted sleep on a bed of hay in the one corner of the barn that did not leak, the dented tin lantern casting a small, defiant circle of light against the immense darkness. She salvaged what she could. With a crowbar she had bought in town, she pried bent, rust-streaked sheets of tin from the collapsed portion of the barn roof. The work was brutal. Each nail fought her, screeching in protest as it was pulled from the dry, stubborn wood. She would then spend an hour each evening by the light of her lantern, painstakingly straightening the old nails on a flat stone with a hammer. It was a slow, tedious task, but nails cost money, and she had almost none. Day by day, inch by inch, she patched the holes in the remaining roof, her arms and back screaming with a pain so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. She rehung the heavy barn door and secured a section for the mare, creating a small island of order in the chaos. Water was the next battle. The collapsed well was beyond her ability to repair alone. She remembered the sheriff's mention of Hawk Draw and the old willows that clung to its banks. Following the line of trees, she found the creek bed, a dry, sandy scar on the earth with only a few stagnant pools of bitter, alkaline water. But her father had taught her to read the land. She saw where the willow roots ran thickest and greenest, and there she began to dig. For 2 days, she fought the baked earth with a shovel until her hands were numb, until finally, 3 feet down, the sand grew dark and cool. Seepage, slow but steady, began to fill the hole. It was not a spring, not a well, but it was water. She lined the pit with stones to keep it from collapsing, and each morning she would return to find a few precious gallons waiting for her. It tasted of mud and minerals, but it was life. Her work required tools and supplies she did not have, and eventually, she had no choice but to ride back into Dry Creek. She needed rope, a few pounds of fresh nails, and advice on how to shore up the barn's leaning wall. She headed for the blacksmith shop, its rhythmic clang the town's heartbeat. When she pushed open the heavy door, the heat and the smell of hot iron washed over her. But it was not a burly, bearded man who turned from the forge. It was a woman, her face smudged with soot, her arms corded with muscle. She held a heavy hammer with an ease that spoke of long practice. "Help you?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "I need some nails and rope," Madeline said, taken aback for a moment. The blacksmith set her hammer down and wiped her hands on a leather apron. "You are the one. The fool who bought the lone lantern." It was not a question. Madeline felt a familiar prickle of defensiveness. "My name is Madeline Farwell." The woman gave a short, sharp laugh. "I am Rue, short for Ruth, but it is a name I have not heard in 20 years. So, you are still out there. I figured the coyotes would have scared you off by now." Despite her blunt words, her eyes held a spark of something that was not mockery. It looked like curiosity. "The coyotes are the least of my concerns," Madeline said, her voice dry. "I am more worried about a wall that is trying to lie down for a nap." Rue's lips twitched into a smile. She looked at Madeline's hands, at the raw, broken blisters. "Looks like you have been introducing yourself to the place. You use green cottonwood for the brace. Find a good, straight trunk. It is strong and it is free. As for nails, I have a bucket of bent ones from a burned-out freight wagon. You can have them for 1/4 of the price if you are willing to do the straightening yourself." "I have become very good at straightening nails," Madeline replied. A bond was formed in that moment, an unspoken understanding between two women making their way in a world that was not built for them. Rue sold her the supplies at a fair price and threw in a length of used, but still strong, steel cable for free. "To keep that wall from getting too lazy," she said with a wink. Their conversation was brief and practical, full of shared quips about the stubbornness of old wood and the foolishness of men. But as Madeline left, she felt a little less alone. She had an ally. A few days later, as she was wrestling a cottonwood brace into place against the barn wall, Sheriff Eli Harper rode out. His visit was unexpected, and, for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she was in some new kind of trouble. He dismounted, his movements economical and calm, and surveyed her work. He noted the patched roof, the cleared yard, and the new stone-lined seat by the creek. "Official business, Miss Farwell," he said, though his eyes held a softer, unofficial light. "Just need to confirm you have taken possession of the property." "As you can see, Sheriff, the property and I are becoming well acquainted." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the heavy brace she had been positioning. "That is a big job for one person." "It is a big job," she agreed, not offering any complaint. He walked the perimeter of her land, his boots making quiet puffs in the red dust. "I mentioned before that the survey lines are in dispute," he said, his back to her. "It might be wise to have the original boundary markers resurveyed and clearly marked. It establishes a clear record, in case of future disagreements." He glanced back at her. "Costs a little money, but it can save a lot of trouble." Disagreements with whom, she asked, though she knew the answer. "With anyone who has an interest in where water flows," he said evasively. He then lowered his voice slightly. "My deputy, Wade, he handles most of the patrols out this way. He is a good man to be careful around. He keeps his eyes open, but sometimes only for things his friends want him to see." The warning was clear. Deputy Wade was Creed Barton's man. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, meeting his gaze. An understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the lines being drawn. He was a man of the law, a law that was supposed to be blind, but he was choosing to help her see. Her next trip to town was for provisions. The small store had what she needed. But as she stepped out, The smell of roasted meat from the saloon was too much to resist. She had been living on hardtack and dried beans for weeks. She pushed open the swinging doors and walked in. The room went quiet. She ignored the stairs and sat at a small table in the corner. The bartender, a heavy man with a tired face, came over. What will it be? Stew and a beer. As she waited, the low murmur of conversation resumed. Centered on her, a cattleman at the bar, his face flushed with whiskey, spoke loudly to his companion. Cannot believe she is still out there. Must be eating dirt and drinking mud. A woman has no business trying to run a ranch, especially not a cursed one. His friend laughed. That little girl ain't got nothing but the clothes on her back. She will be gone by the first snow. Madeline did not look up. She kept her eyes on the scarred wood of her table. When the bartender brought her stew, she began to eat, slowly and deliberately. The cattleman, emboldened by her silence, spoke again, his voice dripping with condescension. Hey, little lady, when you give up on that pile of rocks, I will give you $10 for it. That is a fine profit on your investment. Madeline finished a spoonful of stew, set the spoon down gently, and wiped her mouth with a napkin. She turned her head and looked directly at the man. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the saloon's noise like a razor. I find, she said, her tone as dry as a summer bone, that I prefer the company of my rocks to the company in here. A dead silence fell over the room. The cattleman's face went from red to purple, from his spot at the end of the bar. Sheriff Harper, who had been nursing a coffee, watched the entire exchange, a flicker of deep respect. Almost a smile touched his eyes before he looked down into his cup. The cattleman sputtered, but found no retort. Madeline turned back to her stew and finished her meal in peace. The first real attack came a week later. She awoke one morning to the sound of bleating. A flock of at least 50 of Creed Barton's sheep were grazing on the small patch of grass near her barn, the very patch she had been carefully nurturing for her own mare. She ran out, waving her arms and shouting, driving the stupid, placid animals back across her fence line, which had been deliberately cut. She rode into town, her anger a hot coal in her chest, and went straight to the sheriff's office. Eli was not there. Deputy Wade was, his feet propped on the desk, a smug look on his face. He listened to her complaint with a show of exaggerated patience. Sheep, you say, he drawled, not bothering to move his feet. Well, ma'am, fences break. Animals wander. It is the way of things. My fence was cut, deputy. You see someone cut it? He asked, a lazy challenge in his eyes. It was cut clean with wire cutters. Things get old. Wire gets brittle. Maybe the wind did it. He finally swung his feet to the floor and stood up, his belt slung low on his hips. He walked toward her, crowding her space, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating tone. Mister, Barton runs a lot of livestock. They need a lot of land to graze. A smart person would understand that. A smart person would know not to make trouble over a few mouthfuls of grass. Madeline stood her ground, refusing to be backed down by his physical presence. But she knew this was a dead end. He was not here to enforce the law. He was here to enforce Creed's will. She left the office without another word, her anger now mixed with a cold dose of fear. That evening, as the sun set, she brought the dented tin lantern out of the barn. She had spent an hour the night before polishing it, rubbing away the soot and grime until the tin shone with a soft, silvery light. She hung it on a nail she had driven into the main post of the barn's entrance. She lit the wick, and its steady, golden flame pushed back against the encroaching twilight. It was a small light, fragile against the vast, indifferent landscape. But it was her light. It meant she was still there. It meant she was not running. She had moved from simply defending her small space to actively claiming it, and the lantern was her flag. A quiet declaration of war. The small trickle of water from Hawk Draw had become the lifeblood of the lone lantern. It filled the stone-lined seep Madeline had dug and nourished the small patch of pasture she painstakingly cultivated. It was a thin thread of hope, and one morning, she found it severed. She walked the creek bed and discovered the cause a quarter-mile upstream, a dam of rocks and packed mud, crudely but effectively built, blocked the channel, diverting the meager flow away from her land. The rocks were too large to have fallen naturally. The mud was packed tight with the clear imprint of a shovel's blade. It was a deliberate act of thirst. Her small field of grass, which had just begun to show a healthy green, was already starting to yellow at the edges. A cold fury settled in her chest. This was not the work of a random drifter. This was a message from Creed Barton, delivered by the hands of his men. She spent the entire day dismantling the dam, her body aching with the strain of moving heavy, slick rocks and digging through the dense mud. By evening, the water flowed again, a muddy, reluctant stream. But it flowed. She knew, however, that this was only the beginning. They would be back. The effort had left her muscles screaming in protest, and a deep, throbbing ache settled in her lower back. The next day, the pain forced her to ride into town to see the community's physician. Dr. Salazar was a kind, elderly man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen more than their share of suffering. His office smelled of carbolic acid and herbs. As he applied a pungent liniment to her strained back and bandaged the fresh set of blisters on her hands, he clucked his tongue in a sound of paternal disapproval. "You work too hard, child," he said, his voice soft. "This land, it asks for everything. Sometimes it takes it even when you do not offer." "I do not have a choice. Doctor," Madeline said through gritted teeth as he pressed on a particularly sore muscle. "No, I suppose you do not." He finished his work and began cleaning his instruments. "You are ruffling the wrong feathers. You know, Creed Barton does not like to be challenged, not even over a dry patch of dirt like the Lone Lantern." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "Sheriff Harper has been keeping an eye on you, has he not?" Madeline nodded. "He has been fair." Dr. Salazar smiled a little sadly. "Eli is a good man. He believes in the law, a rare thing in these parts. Most men only believe in the parts of the law that benefit them." He sighed, his gaze becoming distant. He was not always a sheriff. You know, he was set to marry the eldest daughter of the Redford family. They were the biggest cattle barons in this county before Barton came along. Eli was going to run the whole operation one day. "What happened?" Madeline asked. Her curiosity piqued. "There was a dispute over grazing rights. A man was shot, a small rancher. The Redfords called it a hunting accident. Said the man was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Everyone knew better, but no one would speak up. Eli was there. He saw what happened. He broke the engagement, gave up his position with the family, and testified against them. The man who pulled the trigger, one of the Redford sons, was convicted." The doctor shook his head slowly. "The Redfords never forgave him. They lost face, and eventually, they lost their hold on the county. Barton moved in and picked up the pieces. Eli, he carries that day with him. That is why he is so rigid about the law. He saw what happens when powerful men bend it to their will." Madeline left the doctor's office with a new understanding of the quiet, watchful sheriff. His interest in her struggle was not just procedural, it was personal. He was a man who had chosen a difficult, lonely path because of his principles, and he recognized a kindred spirit in her defiance. The sky had been a strange, bruised yellow all day. The air was heavy and still, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on the land, silencing the birds and insects. By late afternoon, a dark wall began to build on the western horizon. It was not a cloud of rain, but a churning, angry mass of red dust. Rue, who had ridden out to bring Madeline a newly forged spade head, saw it and her face tightened. "Dust storm," she said, her voice grim. "A bad one. Secure everything." They worked with a desperate urgency, reinforcing the barn doors and shuttering the single window. As the first gust of wind hit, a low moan that grew into a roar, they saw a half-dozen young calves, strays from a neighboring herd, wandering bewildered in the open field. Their mother was nowhere in sight. They were completely exposed. "We have to get them into the arroyo," Madeline shouted over the rising wind. The deep, rocky wash at the edge of her property was their only chance for shelter. What followed was a nightmare of grit and terror. The wind came in a solid wave, carrying a blinding curtain of dust that reduced visibility to a few feet and scoured the skin. It was impossible to breathe without covering her face with a cloth. The calves, panicked by the noise and the stinging dust, scattered. Madeline and Rue fought their way through the maelstrom, their horses whinnying in fear. Madeline managed to get a rope around one calf, the small animal bucking and kicking with surprising strength. The air was so thick with dust it was like moving through water. Suddenly, another rider emerged from the red gloom. It was Eli Harper. He must have seen the storm gathering and ridden out to check on her. Without a word, he was in the thick of it, his movements calm and efficient even in the chaos. He cornered one of the terrified animals against a rock outcropping and expertly looped his rope over its head. The wind rose to a shriek, and then came a new sound, a hard, drumming rattle. Hail, stones of ice, some as big as robin's eggs, began to lash down, driven sideways by the furious wind. They stung like thrown rocks. One of the calves went down, its leg buckling. Madeline threw herself off her horse and ran to it, trying to shield the small creature with her own body as the ice hammered her back and shoulders. Eli was there in an instant. He grabbed a heavy tarp from his saddle roll and threw it over both of them. For a moment they were huddled together in the roaring darkness, the hail pounding a deafening rhythm on the canvas just inches above their heads. He had one arm around her, holding the tarp in place, and in the midst of the violent chaos of the storm, she was acutely aware of the solid strength of his hold. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a pure act of survival, a human shield against the fury of nature. His hand brushed hers as they both tried to soothe the trembling calf, a brief, functional touch that sent an unexpected jolt through her. Together, they managed to get the calf back on its feet and half carried, half dragged it and the others into the relative safety of the rock arroyo. They huddled there, horses and humans and calves, while the storm raged around them, a symphony of wind and ice and darkness. When it finally passed, the silence it left behind was as stunning as the noise had been. The world was remade, coated in a thick layer of red mud and bruised by ice. The sun broke through, weak and watery, illuminating the devastation. Eli helped her check the damage. The barn roof had held, thanks to her careful work with the salvaged tin. Her small garden was annihilated, but the animals were safe. "You did good work here, Miss Farwell," Eli said, his voice low and hoarse from the dust. He looked at her face streaked with mud, her hair wild, a dark bruise already forming on her cheek where a piece of hail had struck her. His eyes held a deep, unguarded admiration. After he left, the adrenaline faded, and a profound exhaustion took its place. Rue stayed to help her clean up the worst of the mess. As they sat by a small fire that evening, sipping bitter coffee, the full weight of her situation crashed down on Madeline. She stared into the flames, her body a map of aches and bruises. "I am scared, Rue," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I am not scared of storms or hard work, but I am scared that they are right. All those men in the saloon, all the people who laughed. I am terrified that I am going to lose this place, that I will end up with nothing all over again, and it will be because I was just as big a fool as they all said I was." The next morning, she went to check the diversion dam on Hawk Draw, expecting to find it rebuilt. It was not, but she found something else. Beside the creek, in the soft mud left by the storm, was a single, perfect boot print. It was huge, much larger than any boot she had ever seen, and a little farther downstream, she saw that one of the new wooden stakes Eli had advised her to place, marking the boundary of her property, had been pulled from the ground and tossed aside. It was a clear, unmistakable message. The games were over. Someone had been on her land, claiming it as their own. It was a violation. a silent threat more chilling than any storm, a name she had heard whispered in town, a name associated with Creed Barton's dirtiest work. Came to her mind Leviathan. The monster had entered her home. The courtroom was a crucible, hot and airless, packed with the curious and the concerned. Every man who had laughed at Madeline that first day seemed to be there, their faces now tight with a different kind of interest. Creed Barton sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a slick man from a bigger city, looking as cool and unbothered as if he were discussing the price of cattle. Madeline sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly on the rough-hewn wood. Her stomach was a knot of ice, but her back was straight. Across the room, Sheriff Eli Harper stood by the door, his expression unreadable, his presence a solid, grounding force in the swirling tension. The traveling judge, a man named Ferris, was impatient and irritable, his face beaded with sweat. He listened with a weary expression as Barton's lawyer laid out their case. He presented the newly commissioned survey map, a clean, professional document full of sharp lines and precise measurements. It clearly showed the main channel of Hawk Draw skirting the edge of the Lone Lantern property, placing the water rights firmly downstream, on land recently acquired by Creed Barton. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and confident, "the principle of beneficial use is clear. My client, Mr. Barton, runs an operation vital to the economy of this county. He requires reliable access to water. This new survey simply corrects an old, inaccurate mapping, ensuring the water is put to its most productive and beneficial purpose." He called Deputy Wade to the stand. Wade swaggered up, took the oath, and proceeded to lie with practiced ease. He testified that he had patrolled that area for years and that the creek bed on Miss Farwell's property had always been mostly dry, just a trickle. "Your Honor," he said, avoiding Eli's gaze, "never amounted to much. The main flow has always been further south." When it was Madeline's turn to question him, her voice was low but steady. "Deputy, are you saying the willows that have grown along that creek for 50 years have been surviving on just a trickle?" Wade shifted in his seat. "I am not an expert on trees, ma'am." "And are you saying that the deep scoured channel that runs through my land was carved by this same trickle?" "Droughts change things. The land shifts," he mumbled, his eyes darting toward Creed. Madeline had no maps, no expert witnesses. She had only the truth, and she could feel it slipping away, buried under the weight of false documents and perjured testimony. The judge was looking at the clock. Then the main doors of the courthouse creaked open. Every head turned. Rue stood there, her leather apron still on, her face smudged with soot. In her hands, she held a dusty, leather-bound book. "Apologies, Your Honor," she boomed, her voice filling the room. "I believe this may be relevant." The judge scowled. "And who might you be?" "Ruth Rue Miller, the blacksmith. I was cleaning out a crate of old scrap I bought from the widow of the previous blacksmith. God rest his soul. Found this at the bottom." She walked forward and placed the book on the judge's bench. "It is the journal of Josiah Finch, the first official surveyor for this county." Barton's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, this is irregular. The document is unverified." But the judge was already opening the book, his irritable expression replaced by one of intense curiosity. The pages were filled with elegant, spidery script and detailed, hand-drawn maps. He turned a page and stopped, running his finger over a specific entry. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Is Dr. Salazar present?" The old doctor stood up from the back of the room. "I am, Your Honor." "Come forward. Doctor, you have been in Dry Creek a long time. Did you know a Josiah Finch?" "I did indeed," the doctor said, approaching the bench. "Set his broken arm once, back in '62. A meticulous man, almost as particular about his bones as he was about his boundary lines." The judge showed him the journal. The doctor peered at it, then nodded decisively. "That is his hand. Without a doubt, I would recognize that fussy capital if anywhere." Judge Ferris turned back to the page. "In this entry, Dated May of 1861, Mr. Finch describes placing the original boundary markers for the Lone Lantern property. He includes a detailed map. The judge held the book up so the court could see the drawing. It clearly showed Hawk Draw splitting the property down the middle. He then read aloud from the surveyor's notes. The primary channel and its associated riparian rights are central to this parcel, providing its main source of value. The northwest marker is a large granite stone, 3 feet high, set deep at the head of the draw. He looked over his spectacles at Creed Barton. This description seems to be at odds with the new survey. A tense silence fell over the room. The new map was a lie, and the old book was its ghost. The judge looked at Madeline. Miss Farwell, do you have anything to add before I make a preliminary ruling? Madeline rose to her feet. She did not look at the judge or at Creed Barton. She looked directly at Eli Harper, who met her gaze from his post by the door. The entire town was watching, waiting. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and carried to every corner of the room. A quiet statement of fact that landed with the force of a hammer blow. Mocked for owning nothing. I bought a broken ranch, she said, her words precise and deliberate. Turns out, the sheriff's heart came with a spine of its own. The words hung in the hot, still air. It was an accusation and a tribute all at once. It was a declaration that one man in the room could not be bought, could not be intimidated. Creed Barton's face became a mask of cold fury. A low murmur swept through the crowd. Eli's expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He had been publicly drawn into the fight, his integrity held up as a shield, and a challenge. Judge Ferris cleared his throat, his gaze sharp. Given this new, conflicting evidence, this court cannot make a final determination today. However, until an independent surveyor can be summoned to locate the original markers as described in Mr. Finch's journal, the situation will revert to the status quo ante. The temporary dam will be removed, and Miss Farwell will be permitted to draw water as the owners of the Lone Lantern have done for the past 30 years. This matter is stayed pending a full survey. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing the finality of a closing door. It was a victory. Fragile and temporary, but a victory nonetheless. As the crowd began to file out, buzzing with the day's events, the sky, which had been growing darker all afternoon, finally broke. The rain came suddenly, a torrential downpour that hammered on the courthouse roof and turned the dusty street into a river of mud. Madeline remained at the table, the tension draining out of her, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. When she finally stood and walked outside, the porch was empty save for one person. Eli was still there, leaning against a post, watching the rain. The air was suddenly cool and clean, the scent of wet earth replacing the stuffy odor of the courtroom. They stood in silence for a long moment, the roar of the rain a curtain around them. He straightened up and turned to face her. His eyes, dark and serious, searched her face. There were 1,000 things to say. About the trial, about the threat she had made against him with her praise, about the danger that was far from over. But words seemed inadequate. He took a step closer, and the space between them became charged. Electric. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray piece of hair from her cheek. The touch was light, but it burned a trail on her skin. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the storm inside him, the rigid control and the deep, buried ache that Dr. Salazar had spoken of. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hard and brief, born of the day's brutal tension and the relief of a battle won. It tasted of rain and dust and a loneliness so profound it stole her breath. It was over as quickly as it began. He pulled back, his eyes never leaving hers, his hand still cupping her jaw. The rain washed the world clean around them, blurring the harsh lines of the town, leaving only the two of them under the shelter of the courthouse porch. Hope, as fresh and sudden as the downpour, began to fall. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and smelling of wet dust and sage. The kiss lingered in the cool air between them, a silent thunderclap that had changed the landscape of their quiet acquaintance. Awkwardness, a thing that had never existed between them, suddenly stood there on the courthouse porch. It was Madeline who broke the silence, her voice practical, though her cheeks were still warm. "The roof on my barn will be leaking." Eli cleared his throat, taking a half-step back, putting a respectable distance between them. "I expect it will." He seemed to be searching for the right words, the proper order of things. "The judge's ruling is temporary. We need to find that granite marker Josiah Finch wrote about. The independent surveyor will need a place to start." It was the perfect excuse, a bridge of practicality over the chasm of what had just happened. It gave him a reason to be at her ranch, and it gave her a reason to accept his presence. And so, a new routine began. The days that followed were filled with the kind of shared labor that builds a foundation stronger than stone. They were no longer just a woman fighting for her land and a sheriff upholding the law. They were partners in a common cause. Their first task was the well. It was still a collapsed ruin, and hauling water from the seep was back-breaking work, with Rue's advice and a great deal of effort. They built a windlass, a heavy wooden drum on a frame that would allow them to haul buckets of rock and debris from the depths. Eli's steady strength and Madeline's stubborn refusal to quit were a perfect match. He would descend into the darkness on a rope, filling the bucket, and she would crank the heavy windlass, her muscles straining, until the load reached the surface. "Are you certain you would not rather be in town?" Writing a citation for a poorly parked horse, she called down to him one afternoon, her voice echoing in the stone-lined shaft. His voice came back, muffled and wry. "And miss the pleasure of your charming company." Not for all the well-parked horses in Texas. They worked side by side, their days measured by the rising sun and the ache in their muscles. They patched the last of the barn roof, their hammers echoing in a companionable rhythm. He taught her how to handle a branding iron, using scraps of leather to practice the steady, even pressure required. The stray calves she had rescued during the storm, now healthy and growing, would be the start of her herd, and they would bear her mark, a simple lantern. The smoke from the practice fires filled the air, and their easy banter filled the silence. The town, of course, was watching. Dry Creek thrived on gossip as much as it did on cattle. Their victory in court had earned Madeline a grudging respect, but her new association with the sheriff sparked a different kind of talk. One day, tacked to the door of the general store, a crudely printed flyer appeared. It spoke of a lone woman and a lawman spending far too much time together, hinting at impropriety and calling her a disgrace to decent folk. Rue tore it down before Madeline saw it, but the story reached her anyway. The first sting of shame was sharp, but it was quickly replaced by a weary anger. She had fought too hard to be brought down by whispers. The next time she was in town, she felt the stares, the hushed conversations that stopped when she drew near. Instead of hurrying past, she paused, looked a group of women directly in the eye, and smiled, a bright, unwavering smile that offered no apology. She held her head high and walked on, leaving them in a flustered silence. She was learning that their judgment was a cage only if she chose to step inside it. As the season turned, the church organized a harvest dance. It was a rare occasion for the scattered community to come together, a night of fiddle music and laughter to celebrate the end of a long, hard summer. Madeline went with Rue, not expecting anything more than a chance to escape the ranch for an evening. She was standing by the refreshment table when Eli appeared at her side. He looked different out of his dusty work clothes, dressed in a clean shirt and string tie. "Miss Farwell," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the cheerful music. "I believe it is the sheriff's duty to ensure all citizens are enjoying the festivities." "Is that so?" "Sheriff," she replied, a playful glint in her eyes. "And how do you propose to enforce that particular ordinance?" "By example." He held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" He led her onto the rough planked floor as the fiddler struck up a slow, sweet waltz. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her with a firm but gentle touch. They moved together easily, as if they had done so 100 times before. The rest of the room seemed to fade away. "You have caused quite a stir in my town, you know," he said, his eyes warm and serious. "I was under the impression it was your town that was causing a stir for me." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face. "Fair enough. I suppose we have both been a bit of a disruption to each other." They danced in a comfortable silence after that. Two quiet souls finding a moment of peace in a world that had offered them very little. A few weeks later, a blue norther blew in. A sudden, vicious blast of cold air from the plains that dropped the temperature by 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Eli had ridden out to help her secure a loose section of fence and was caught by the storm. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving sheets of sleet before it. Riding back to town was impossible. The barn, which had become Madeline's home, was their only shelter. The wind found every crack in the old wood, and a persistent leak they had not been able to reach began to drip near her small stove. As Eli climbed on a crate to try and patch it from the inside, his hand slipped on the slick wood, and he came down hard. A long, deep gash opened on his forearm by a protruding nail. They sat by the small iron stove, the only source of warmth in the cavernous, drafty barn, the lantern, its wick newly trimmed by Eli so that it burned with a brighter, steadier flame, cast their shadows long and dancing on the wall. She carefully cleaned and bandaged his arm, her touch gentle, their breath plumed white in the cold air. To dry out, he had taken off his wet outer coat, and it hung from a peg, steaming slightly in the heat from the stove. "My father was a doctor," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the wind. "He taught me how to do this. He said a steady hand and a clean cloth could solve half the world's problems." She did not talk about how she had lost him, or the life she had before this one, but the sadness was there in the quiet space between her words. He watched her, his gaze intense. "I told you about the Redfords," he said, not a question, but a statement. It was his turn to share a scar. "The man who was shot, his name was Samuel. He had a wife and 2 daughters. I see their faces sometimes when it is quiet." He looked down at her hands on his arm. "I did the right thing. I have never doubted that, but doing the right thing does not always make the world right." The cold deepened as the night wore on. There was only one bed, her simple pallet of hay and blankets, and only one heavy wool blanket to ward off the biting chill. They lay down fully clothed, a respectable distance between them. But the cold was relentless. Shivering, they moved closer, sharing their warmth out of pure necessity. In the flickering light of the lantern, they faced each other. The pretense of sheriff and rancher, of partners in a legal dispute, fell away. They were just a man and a woman, huddled together against a storm. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Madeline," he whispered, her name a prayer against the wind. He kissed her again, and this time there was no desperation, no surprise. It was slow and deep, a quiet affirmation in the heart of the storm. It was a kiss that spoke of shared hardship and silent understanding, of 2 lonely paths that had finally, impossibly, converged. And as the wind howled its lonely song outside the barn, they held each other, and for the first time in a very long time, they were not alone. The lantern burned steadily through the long, cold night. On the small crate that served as a table, a piece of paper lay next to it. On it, drawn in charcoal, was a careful rendering of the lone lantern's property, with a bold, clear line showing Hawk Draw running right through its heart. It was a map not of what was, but of what would be. The quiet intimacy born in the heart of the storm could not last. It was a fragile shelter against a world determined to break it. The first blow of the counterattack was struck not with fire or fists, but with the rustle of paper in the dead of night. In the sheriff's office, lit by a single low-burning lamp, Deputy Wade unlocked the cabinet where Eli kept his official records. He pulled out the leather satchel containing Josiah Finch's journal and the affidavits Eli had begun to collect. Waiting in the shadows was Creed Barton. He did not speak. He simply placed a heavy canvas bag on the desk. The clink of coins was the only sound in the room. Wade emptied the satchel, replacing the real journal with a clever forgery, a book of blank pages. He put Eli's affidavits into the firebox of the stove and accepted the bag of money. The betrayal was complete, a silent, damning transaction that erased the truth. The fire came 2 nights later. Madeline was woken from a deep sleep not by a sound, but by a malevolent, flickering orange light dancing on the walls of the barn. At first, she thought it was the lantern, but then she smelled it, the acrid, hungry scent of burning hay. She scrambled from her bedroll, her heart seizing in her chest. The entire south wall of the barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring curtain of destruction that was eating its way through the dry, old wood with terrifying speed. Panic gave way to a cold, sharp clarity. The calves. She threw open the main doors, the wave of heat so intense it singed her hair, choking on the thick, oily smoke. She ran into the inferno. The small animals were huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide with terror, their bleats lost in the roar of the fire. She untied her mare, slapping its rump to send it galloping out into the safety of the night. Then she plunged into the smoke, grabbing calves, pushing them, herding them toward the open doors. Suddenly, she was not alone. A figure appeared through the smoke, shouting her name. It was Rue, her face a grim mask of determination, a heavy bucket in each hand. And behind her were 2 more people, a man and a woman Madeline recognized from the harvest dance. Jed and Sarah, small ranchers from the next valley over. They must have seen the glow in the sky. Without a word, they formed a desperate bucket brigade from the well, a futile but heroic effort against the raging fire. "We cannot save the barn," Rue yelled, her voice hoarse. "Just get the animals out." Together, they drove the last of the terrified calves from the burning structure. Moments later, the main roof beam gave way with a sound like a cannon shot, sending a fountain of sparks and embers into the night sky. The barn, her home, her shelter, the place where she and Eli had found a moment of peace, collapsed into a fiery ruin. They could only stand and watch, their faces streaked with soot and tears, as everything she had built turned to ash. As the fire raged at the lone lantern, Eli was being lured into a different kind of trap. A frantic rider had galloped into town, claiming a drunken brawl had broken out at a prospector's camp 5 miles to the east. It was a lie, orchestrated by Wade. Eli saddled his horse, his mind already on the trouble. Wade insisted on riding with him. They found the camp quiet, only a single campfire burning. As Eli dismounted, a man stepped out of the shadows, a known henchman of Creed's. Before Eli could speak, a shot rang out. The henchman cried out and fell, clutching a bloody leg. Eli spun around, his own gun drawn, to see Wade standing there, his pistol smoking. "He drew on you," Sheriff Wade shouted, his voice a performance of alarm. "I had no choice." It happened too fast. Before Eli could process the setup, 2 more of Creed's men emerged, their hands raised as if in surrender. They were the witnesses. The trap was sprung. By the time the sun rose on the smoldering ruins of the Lone Lantern, a federal marshal had ridden into Dry Creek, summoned by a telegram Wade had sent hours earlier. He served Eli with a warrant, not for arrest, but for a formal inquiry. He was accused of shooting an unarmed man. His badge and his gun were confiscated pending a hearing. He was legally powerless, stripped of his authority at the exact moment Madeline needed him most. Creed Barton had played his hand perfectly, removing his 2 biggest obstacles in a single night of fire and deceit. Madeline stood in the cold morning light, the bitter smell of wet ash filling the air. Everything was gone. Her tools, her supplies, her shelter. All that remained were her mare and the small herd of calves, now huddled together in the open, shivering and afraid. She was back where she had started, mocked for owning nothing. The fear she had confessed to Rue, the deep, primal fear of losing everything again, was a cold, hard reality. For a moment, she allowed the despair to wash over her, a wave of hopelessness that threatened to pull her under. She could just give up. She could sell the calves for a pittance and walk away. Then she looked at the small, frightened animals, at the brand on their hides, her brand, the lantern, and she felt a flicker of defiance ignite in the ashes of her world. They had burned her home, but they had not burned her. They had taken her sheriff, but they had not taken her will. She would not run. She would hide. There was a place she knew of, a hidden box canyon called Coyote Narrows, accessible only by a treacherous, winding trail. It had water and enough grass to sustain her small herd for a while. It was her only chance. With Rue's help, she gathered the calves, Jed and Sarah, their faces grim with sympathy, gave her a sack of provisions and a heavy canvas tarp. The journey was a descent into a new kind of hell. As she pushed the herd toward the high country, the weather turned again, the temperature plummeted, and a freezing rain began to fall, coating every rock and branch with a treacherous glaze of ice. The trail into Coyote Narrows was barely a path, a narrow ledge carved into the side of a steep cliff. The ice made it a death trap. She led the way, her mare picking its way carefully, the calves following single file. The wind howled through the canyon, a mournful sound that seemed to mock her efforts. One of the smallest calves, its hooves slipping on the icy rock, lost its footing. With a terrified bleat, it slid over the edge, landing on a small ledge 10 feet below. It was unhurt, but trapped. There was no way down. Leaving it was not an option. Madeline looked at the sheer, icy rock face, then at the terrified animal. The fear was a living thing in her throat, but she pushed it down. She took the rope from her saddle, tied one end securely to a sturdy pinyon tree, and looped the other around her waist, hand over hand, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the slick rock. She lowered herself down the cliff face. The ice was like glass. The wind tried to tear her from her perch. Every muscle screamed in protest. Below her, the calf cried, a pitiful, lonely sound. She finally reached the ledge, her hands numb and bleeding, her body shaking from cold and exertion. She untied the rope from her waist and, with gentle, calming words, managed to secure it around the calf. Then came the brutal, seemingly impossible task of hauling the 50-pound animal back up to the trail. She climbed, pulling the rope, her own weight a precarious anchor. The calf struggled, its weight a dead drag. The rope cut into her frozen hands. For a horrifying moment, her foot slipped, and she dangled there, her life and the life of the calf held by the strength of her grip. Gritting her teeth, she found a new hold. She pulled, inch by agonizing inch. She was not just pulling a calf, she was pulling her future up from the abyss. Finally, gasping for breath, she heaved the small animal back onto the trail. She collapsed next to it, her body spent, but her spirit unbroken. She had faced the bottom, the absolute loss of everything, and she had not quit. In the heart of the ice and the wind, covered in mud and blood, she had saved a part of herself. The dawn in Coyote Narrows was a silent, creeping thing, painting the high red rock walls in shades of rose and rust. Madeline moved with a practiced quiet, checking on her small herd. They were safe here, hidden from the world. But it was a temporary peace. Survival in this hidden canyon was not a life. It was a holding pattern, a breath held against the inevitable. She could not hide forever. Creed Barton would not simply let her disappear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the footfall of an approaching enemy. Back in Dry Creek, a different kind of search was underway, in the dim, quiet confines of Dr. Salazar's office. He and Rue pored over the forged journal Wade had planted in the sheriff's office. It was a good fake. The leather aged, the paper yellowed, but it felt wrong. It was too clean, too empty. Josiah Finch was a man who wrote down everything, the doctor mused, his fingers tracing the blank pages. What he ate for breakfast, the state of the weather, his opinion of the blacksmith's dog. He would not have left a working journal empty. Rue, whose mind worked on problems with the same direct force she used on hot iron, slammed her hand on the table. So where is the real one? Wade is a snake, but he is not a smart one. He would have gotten rid of it, thrown it down a well, burned it. Perhaps, Dr. Salazar said slowly, his eyes distant. But Josiah was a deeply religious man, a deacon at the church for 20 years. He believed in judgment, in a permanent record. To him, that journal was more than a book of maps. It was a book of truths. Burning it would have been like burning a piece of the gospel. An idea sparked between them, a shared, silent thought. The doctor grabbed his hat. The church, he said, his family donated his personal effects to the church after he passed. Most of it was distributed, but they kept his personal Bible as a memorial. They found the old, heavy Bible on a dusty shelf in the pastor's study. It was bound in black leather, the name Josiah Finch embossed in faded gold on the cover, with trembling hands. The doctor opened it. The pages were thin, almost translucent with age. Tucked carefully between the pages of the Book of Numbers was a slim, leather-bound volume. It was the real journal, and as proof of its authenticity. Nestled in the final page was a folded legal document with a faint, brittle wax seal, an official copy of the original property survey filed with the territorial capital, a document Creed and his corrupt commissioner thought was long lost. They had it. They had the ironclad truth. At that same moment, as the first rays of sun crested the canyon wall, Madeline's fragile peace was shattered. A half-dozen riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, blocking the only exit, Leviathan. The huge, silent man who left the boot print was at their head. Beside him sat Deputy Wade, his face a mask of grim resolve, and behind them, on a fine black horse, was Creed Barton, his thin smile a slash of victory in the morning light. Madeline gathered her small herd behind her, her hand resting on the stock of the rifle she carried. She was trapped. "This is the end of the line. Miss Farwell," Creed called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, but it is over now. Leave the calves and you can walk away." "Those calves are mine," she called back, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "And this land is not yours to command." From the rocks above, a new voice cut through the tension. "Calm and clear. She is right, Creed. This is not your land." Eli Harper stepped into view on a high ledge overlooking the scene. He did not wear his badge, but he held a rifle with a familiar ease. He was not here as the law. He was here as a man. He made his way down a narrow game trail, his movements sure and steady, until he stood beside her. Shoulder to shoulder, they faced the men who had come to destroy them. "Harper," Creed sneered, "playing the hero without a badge. You have no authority here." "I am not here on authority," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am here as a witness." He looked past Creed, his eyes locking onto Wade. "You still wear that badge? Wade, you took an oath. Are you going to let him do this?" Wade flinched, his hand moving uncertainly toward the pistol on his hip. "Stay out of this, Eli. This does not concern you." "It concerns any man who stands by and watches a thief at work," Eli retorted. Creed had heard enough. He gave a sharp nod to Leviathan. The big man raised his rifle. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet whining off the rock inches from Eli's head. The battle began. It was not a grand shootout. It was a desperate, ugly scramble for survival. Eli and Madeline used the rocks for cover, their shots careful and measured. They had few bullets and could not afford to waste them. Creed's men, overconfident, fired wildly. The canyon filled with the smell of gunpowder and the terrifying sound of ricocheting lead. One of Creed's men cried out, his arm shattered by a well-aimed shot from Madeline's rifle. Eli was not shooting to kill. He aimed for hands, for legs, for the rock walls just beside the men, using the threat of his skill to pin them down. He was fighting a battle of nerves, not of attrition. He saw Wade take aim at Madeline, and instead of firing, Eli shouted his name. "Wade, do not do it." Wade hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. He saw Eli, exposed for a moment, take aim not at him, but at the rifle in Leviathan's hands, shattering the stock and rendering the weapon useless. He saw a man who could have killed them all 10 times over, choosing not to. He saw honor, and in that moment, his loyalty to Creed's money and power finally broke. As Creed raised his own pistol to take a final shot at Eli, Wade spun around and fired. The bullet tore through Creed's shoulder, sending him staggering back with a cry of shock and pain. The fight was over. The procession that rode into Dry Creek at high noon was a sight the town would never forget. Madeline and Eli led the way, their faces grim and determined. Behind them came Creed's men, disarmed and defeated. Wade rode beside Creed, his face pale. The gravity of his choice settled upon him. Creed himself was slumped in his saddle, his arm in a crude sling, his arrogance finally shattered. They were met in the middle of Main Street by Dr. Salazar and Rue. The whole town seemed to be there, a silent, watchful audience. The county commissioner, a portly, sweating man, bustled out of his office, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered. "The meaning," said Dr. Salazar, holding up the old leather-bound journal, "is that the truth has come home." He opened the book for the commissioner to see, pointing to Josiah Finch's elegant script and detailed map. He then produced the folded, wax-sealed document, and this is a certified copy of the original survey, filed with the territory. It seems the Lone Lantern has always had the rights to hawk draw, and it seems, Commissioner, that the new survey map you so hastily approved was a fraud. The commissioner's face went white. He looked from the journal to Creed, his composure crumbling. Rue stepped forward, her voice ringing with the clarity of struck steel. "We also have a sworn statement from Deputy Wade, confessing to the conspiracy to falsify documents, to commit arson, and to frame Sheriff Harper. He has confessed that you, Commissioner, were paid a substantial sum to look the other way." The commissioner sputtered, his lies dying on his lips. Creed Barton, the man who had owned the town, who had bent the law and the people to his will, was finished. There was no dramatic speech, no final act of defiance. He simply bowed his head, the weight of his crimes finally crushing him. The federal marshal, who had been watching from the sheriff's office, stepped forward and quietly took him into custody. In the sudden silence that followed, Madeline stood in the middle of the street, the dust settling around her. The wind tugged at her worn dress. She was covered in grime, exhausted to the bone, but for the first time since she had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving land, she did not feel the need to defend herself. She stood her ground not in defiance, but in peace. She was not trembling. Eli walked over to her, ignoring the crowd, ignoring the aftermath of the battle. He looked at her, and his gaze held none of the caution or duty that had defined him for so long. He saw the woman who had faced down fire and ice, who had met violence with courage and lies with an unbreakable spirit. He looked at her as if he were looking at the other half of his own soul, the co-owner of a life he was just now beginning to understand. The long night was over. The dawn was finally here. The aftermath was a quiet unraveling. Dry Creek held its breath, the silence on Main Street a stark contrast to the explosive confrontation that had taken place there. Creed Barton was in the town jail, his wounded pride a more palpable presence than his wounded shoulder. The federal marshal, a man who believed in process and paperwork, spent 2 days meticulously taking statements and collecting evidence. Deputy Wade, his betrayal now a heavy, irreversible fact, sang like a canary, detailing every transaction, every threat, every lie that had been woven into the fabric of Creed's ambition. The commissioner, stripped of his office and his dignity, confessed his own part in the conspiracy. his blustering facade collapsing into a pathetic heap of excuses. The town that had once mocked Madeline now looked upon her with a kind of awe. She had come with nothing and had faced down the biggest man in the county, armed with little more than a stubborn refusal to break. The law, which had once seemed a tool for the powerful, had, through Eli's steadfastness, finally bent toward justice. The official paperwork from the territorial capital, authenticated by the marshal, was filed. The fraudulent survey was expunged. The old, true lines drawn by Josiah Finch were restored, and the water rights to Hawk Draw were declared to belong, unequivocally and forever, to the Lone Lantern Ranch. A week later, his name cleared and his integrity vindicated. Eli was offered his badge back. The town council was unanimous. They wanted their sheriff. He sat with Madeline on the banks of the now freely flowing creek, the sound of the water a peaceful, constant murmur. The ashes of her barn were a stark black scar on the landscape, but the cottonwood trees by the well were putting out new, green leaves. "I am not going to take it," he said, his voice quiet. He tossed a flat stone into the water, watching it skip twice before sinking. Madeline looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It is what you are, Eli, a lawman." "It is what I was," he corrected gently. "For a long time, I thought the only thing a man could do was hold the line, keep the peace, stop the bad from overwhelming the good. I spent years just holding things together." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a new, clear light. "But watching you, you were not just holding on. You were building something out of nothing. I have spent enough of my life being the wall. I want to be a builder now." He told her his plan. The territorial government, embarrassed by the corruption in Dry Creek, needed a new surveyor, an honest man to redraw the lines and fix the messes that men like Creed had made. It was a job that would take him all over the county, establishing order, creating foundations. It was work that looked to the future. He had accepted. The rebuilding of the Lone Lantern became a community affair. The day after Eli's decision, Jed and Sarah arrived with a wagon full of fresh lumber, their quiet offering a testament to the respect Madeline had earned. Rue closed her blacksmith shop for 3 days, arriving with a toolbox, a strong back, and a string of rye. Encouraging insults. Even some of the men who had laughed at the auction came, hats in hand, offering a day's labor as a silent apology. Eli worked alongside them, his hammer blows ringing in time with theirs. He was no longer the town's sheriff, a figure of authority set apart from them. He was just a man, building a home. He and Madeline worked as one, their movements in easy sync, their shared glances a language all their own. They did not rebuild the barn in the same spot. Instead, on a small rise overlooking the creek, they began to build a house, small and sturdy, with a porch that would face the setting sun. Their wedding was held on a clear, cool afternoon in late autumn, in the yard of the half-finished house. The walls were up, but the roof was still open to the vast blue sky. There was no fancy dress, no crowd of guests. The traveling preacher stood on a stack of lumber. Madeline wore a simple blue dress Sarah had helped her make. Eli wore a clean shirt. Their only witnesses were their true friends Rue, who stood beside Madeline, her face uncharacteristically soft, Dr. Salazar, who beamed like a proud father, and Jed and Sarah, holding hands and smiling. A neighbor played a fiddle, the sweet, simple notes drifting on the clean air. They spoke their vows in quiet, steady voices, promises not of ease or riches, but of steadfastness, of shared work and shared warmth, instead of a cake. Sarah had baked a pan of sweet cornbread. Rue, for her wedding gift, laughed and tossed a heavy, newly forged horseshoe onto the porch. "For luck," she boomed. "And to remind you that the most useful things are made of iron and fire." 2 years passed. The seasons turned, bringing with them a harsh, dry summer that tested the resilience of everyone in the valley. The creek ran low, and the grass turned brown. But the well at the Lone Lantern, now fully restored and deep, never failed. The small herd of calves Madeline had saved grew strong, their hides bearing the mark of the lantern. The house was finished, a solid, welcoming presence on the land. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Madeline sat on the porch, a worn journal open on her lap. Eli was down by the fence line, mending a break, his familiar silhouette a comfort against the darkening plains. A lamp burned brightly in the window, its light spilling out into the yard. She picked up a pencil and wrote, her neat script filling the page. They mocked me for owning nothing. Now I own the work of my hands, the water we fought for, and the man who chose to stay. She looked up from the page, a soft smile on her lips. The setting sun caught the top strand of the barbed wire fence, turning the harsh metal into a thread of pure, shimmering silver. On the post of the porch, the old, dented tin lantern she had pulled from the ashes hung in its place of honor. She lit it, as she did every evening. Its steady, golden flame pushed back against the twilight. It was no longer the light of a lone woman in a ruined world. It was a beacon. The lone lantern was, at last, a home. Thank you for being part of this story with us. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Night, liking the video, and supporting us further by pressing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.